clamour is getting closer. The call to return cultural and historical artefacts often taken during colonial rule is getting louder and louder. France's President Emmanuel Macron promised last month to return art pieces to Benin, and with thousands of pieces housed in Western museums, the question for some is Macron setting what they consider to be a dangerous precedent? Good to have your company. You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Now, the world's large museums might well argue that their World Heritage objects are more accessible and seen more widely by thousands of international visitors, but they have built up enormous collections, and many pieces are quite simply not theirs. So is that really where they belong?
Last month, French President Emmanuel Macron promised to return 26 artworks taken by French troops from Benin in West Africa in the late 1800s. A report for the government recommended it restore thousands of cultural treasures to Africa. From the British Museum to the V&A, Western galleries house thousands of artworks plundered during imperial rule. Some say developing countries lack the facilities to look after valuable pieces of African heritage. But Senegal has just opened its prestigious Museum of Black Civilizations. Is this a sign of Africa's growing confidence to showcase its own culture? Western museums sometimes loan items to African nations, but is it time these artifacts were returned for good?
Well, let us get the conversation going. I'm pleased to say that from Edinburgh in Scotland we have Tiffany Jenkins, author of Keeping Their Marbles, How the Treasures of the Past Ended Up in Museums and Why They Should Stay There. With me at the round table, we have Mulugeta Asrate Kassa, formerly an advisor to the Ethiopian embassy here and now with Asrate, which lobbies for the return of Ethiopian artefacts, and Tim Schadla-Hall from the Institute of Archaeology at University College London. Welcome to you all. We are talking about history, but let's introduce the present to this, Tim, because we're hearing a lot about it with Emmanuel Macron and other people as well. It's become sort of fashionable, if you like. Why is that?
Let me make a point. When you say fashionable, the return of artefacts, as Tiffany well knows, and the demand for it has gone on for years. I mean, people have been demanding the return, for example, of the Elgin marbles from the British Museum since the middle of the 19th century, if not earlier. So actually, in one sense, there's always been a demand for the return of artefacts.
But the clamour is getting louder.
The clamour recently seems to have been louder, partly because of press coverage, I think, which is interesting, and also partly because of the politics of return and the use of artefacts in international diplomacy. So, for example, I wouldn't want to suggest for one moment that the French wish to return material to Africa previously looted for political purposes as well as for recognition purposes, but it may well be partly connected.
So it's sort of, I couldn't possibly say this, but...
Yeah, the business of restitution and return is much wider than just a demand to return artifacts that identify people. The underlying pressures are political and economic as well as national.
I'm going to come to you, Mulugeta, in a moment to tell me the particular story you have about the Magdala treasures. But let's go to Tiffany. And we've suggested that the calls are getting louder, hinted at the reasons, and yet your view is that these objects are mostly better off staying where they are.
Well, I think the case for repatriation should be taken on a case-by-case basis. I think Tim's point about the wider political and social context is really important for explaining why the calls are getting louder. And I would say really in the last 30 or 40 years, you've seen a number of trends. One is that the mission of the museum is no longer clear-cut. It's no longer set in stone, if you like. Two is the political demands, the way in which maybe identity movements stopped talking about the economy and started talking more about cultural recognition. So you see this idea that if you send an object back, it may affirm some sort of identity. And those political demands are one reason why it's become such a prominent issue. And you also have to ask who benefits. Say in the case of President Macron, what does he get out of it? Well, he certainly looks good, doesn't he, when at home he is unable to deal with an uprising. He can nonetheless on the world stage look really good as a way of kind of setting himself against colonization, which we all know now conveniently is a bad thing.
Well, Tiffany, I want you to listen to what Mulugeta has to say about the Magdala treasures. And you may be familiar with the whole story as well. Awful lot of them at the British Museum here in London. An exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum. But you don't want them to be there. You want them to be back in Ethiopia.
Yes.
And they were taken, what, in the 1860s, early 1868?
Yes.
And they are valuable to Ethiopia.
Indeed.
Because of what?
Because the idea that a rescue mission to rescue British hostages ended up in plundering the nation and then using it in European cities and towns and exhibiting it as if it is a war booty. This is an insult to the intelligence of Ethiopians.
But these are also religiously important artifacts.
They are also religiously important.
Including copies of the original tablets that Moses was believed to have written.
Absolutely. What has happened immediately after Emperor Theodorus committed suicide is that the soldiers went on a rampage into monasteries and churches, and sacrilegious acts of plundering took place. The original Ark of Covenant is in Aksum in northern Ethiopia, but these are replicas of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which are used even today for worship purposes. One of the unique, I can say, is a painting of the head of Jesus Christ. That was taken, and nobody knows its whereabouts as we speak.
Can I just say, these objects are not only important to you, they are extremely delicate in some ways. They're only handled by certain people. There are procedures to be gone through. Moving them, this is a question for you, Tim, moving them is a risk in itself, isn't it?
It always is. And it's often used, dare I suggest, by some national museums as an excuse for not doing the job. There are always conservation problems, especially with delicate objects. For example, the French recently loaned back Valet's dagger to the Maltese, but wouldn't bring back the sword, from the 18th century, simply because they said it was too delicate to bring it. Now, I'm not a conservator, but I often think the problems of conservation are overemphasized as an excuse.
Would you think it's a valid reason to be very careful about moving them?
Completely nonsense. You know, you can take the 10 tablets in Ethiopia in a box, and
these are copies of the Ten Commandments.
They are copies of the Ten Commandments. They are very old, very delicate, and we need them. We've had one, for example, about 15 years ago. A gentleman who was clearing up his attic found a tablet, which is a tablet. He contacted the Ethiopian embassy, and it was arranged. This frightened museums because a tumultuous welcome for the tablet awaited in Ethiopia. And the British Museum has 8 to 10 tablets which are kept in the basement.
In a locked room. Well, this is the point, Tiffany. What is the point in keeping them? I'll read you the intro from this article here. On a shelf in a locked basement, 11 wooden tablets covered in purple velvet. Nobody, not even including the director of the museum, is permitted to enter the room. What is the point in keeping them here when the Ethiopians would so dearly love to have them, might allow people to see them, and it would restore a sense of national pride? They're locked in a dusty old basement in London. They're not doing anybody any good.
No, I agree. I think the ones that are locked in the British Museum that the director is not even permitted to see should not be there. If they're in a museum, they should be available to researchers and to the public. They shouldn't be locked away, particularly if they are of real importance to some people. There are cases, though, where they do provide great great sort of curiosity and wonder. So at the V&A, which I think has offered to lend those treasures, you can see them in the context of the other in the silver galleries. You can see they tell you the story of how they were acquired. They have a big plaque quoted from Gladstone, who was against it at the time, Queen Victoria. I mean, it places it in some sort of historical context, which is very enlightening. So I think there are different ways you can do it. But yeah, if they're in a basement, send them back.
Mulugeta, one of the arguments not only is that they get seen by more people, but that the countries to which they would be returned cannot possibly look after them as well. And you're going to tell me that that's not the case in Ethiopia, but I will point you in the direction of a story from a newspaper from about 5 years ago. The church where it's believed this Ark of the Covenant is kept, St. Mary's in Ethiopia, had a leaking roof. And it was said that this was a terrible place to keep something of such extraordinary value, both historically and priceless in many ways. It might have to be moved, etc., etc. You just can't look after them.
Oh my God, this is a lame excuse on the part of the museums who consider to be custodians of African treasures. With regard to the Aksum being the place where the original Ark of Covenant is kept, it is in the basement, 2 or 3 grounds, and there's no leak at the moment. And if there is any leak, the church has all the resources to mend it without any damage being done to the tablets. This is a lame excuse. Can I come at this point and mention a newfangled idea that has come from the V&A, which is
a Victorian Albert, we should say.
Victoria and Albert Museum.
And they have an exhibition running till
Yes,
next year.
till
Big
next
plug
year.
for it.
Absolutely.
For the Magdala treasures.
I'm very honored to be part of that. And it's a good idea. We have mixed feelings as Ethiopians. The first is positive. The positive being, yes, thank God, on the 100th centennial celebration of what we call the death of Theodros and not the Magdala expedition, such an event is taking place. Tourists and the British will be able to see what a treasure Ethiopia has, what a historical might Ethiopia has, what a civilization Ethiopia has. That's good. The other thing, the most debatable point, is the offer. The offer is long term. Now, how long is long term? I want to use it. Is it a euphemism for perpetuity? If that is the case, thank you very much.
Yeah, but what it really means is it's for as long as we think is okay until we decide it isn't.
There's the point. At the moment, no sooner had the V&A declared that than the Ethiopian government totally rejected the idea.
Yeah.
Totally rejected. Because the very word loan is, the Ethiopians are allergic to loan. It's just like saying, look, somebody comes and steals your mobile and say, I can loan you.
I'll give it to you back as long as it's just a loan. Tiffany, quick one here. When it comes to objects being returned to countries that have previously been colonized, such as Benin, do you think it's correct, because these countries themselves have a history of oppression, of slave trading, etc., etc., and some of the objects may well have been made by slaves or under forced labor, etc. Do you not think it's a little bit hypocritical, perhaps, for countries to be suggesting that they need to come back to us when they were perhaps originated under nefarious means?
I think that is the danger of some of the arguments put forward for repatriation. If you followed them through, for example, you would send quite a few things back from the Louvre, not to other nations, but to people within France who are descendants of the king, who the revolutionaries killed on the guillotine and then took his art collection. History is really long and complicated, and it shouldn't be a morality play in terms of looking back and finding out who did the worst things to each other, and using that for the basis for return. Return or redistribution should be done on the basis of where is best for the artifact. You know, where is it held beautifully? Where can it be seen? And where can it be understood in different contexts? So the Parthenon marbles in the British Museum can be understood in the context of other cultures.
What we call the
In
Elgin marbles in some cases.
In some cases, yeah. And the ones in the Acropolis Museum in Athens can be seen close to the original location and in relationship to pre-classical antiquity. So there are two contexts there that are very productive for audiences and researchers. Those are the questions that we should be thinking about.
Mulugeta, I'm going to ask you in a moment to tell me the story that you mentioned beforehand about something that you believed was incredibly successful in being returned from Italy.
Oh, yes.
Tell me that in just a moment. But Tiffany's right, isn't she, Tim? I mean, the list goes on and on and on. Not only the Elgin marbles or the Parthenon marbles, but the Rosetta Stone, which was used as the original cipher to translate hieroglyphs.
That's right. I was just thinking, though, about 20 years ago, I went to the National Museum in China to look at a brilliant exhibition on the Silk Route and the Silk Route caves. When I looked into it, the only part of the script that was only in Mandarin was about the people who did the looting. Yeah, Oral Stein for the British, the French, and the Americans. You went round the exhibition, and in various cases were on loan from the Metropolitan Museum, New York, on loan from the British Museum, on loan from the Louvre. And I said to my Chinese colleagues, look, now they're here, why not hang on to them?
But, you know, I was just thinking the same thing as you were telling me this.
And they all looked horrified and said, it's a matter of international diplomacy. And one of the points that is important to bear in mind is that artifacts have become a matter of international diplomacy. We know, for example...
They're used as trading chips.
Precisely. We know the previous French government actually gave material back to Asia, in order to get contracts to build underground railways. So we're looking at a much bigger framework than that, and it is much more complicated. Just returning to the point about museum loans, any professional museum would specify the length of a loan if it went back to Ethiopia, and then it would require renewal on a regular basis.
Tell us the story about the object you had returned from Italy.
This is a very successful campaign by Afromet.
Which is the Association for Returning the Magdala Ethiopian Treasures.
Absolutely right, absolutely right. And the government of Ethiopia together have been campaigning. And 11 years ago, at the height of the Ethiopian Millennium celebrations, because we follow a variant of the Julian calendar, so we had it in 2007, they returned it brick by brick.
What was it?
It's an obelisk. It was an obelisk, and it is now fully erected, and tourists come and view it. So that's a goodwill gesture by the Italians, and Britain can do it immediately, one thing, and that is they can repatriate the remains of Prince Alemayehu, the son of Emperor Theodros, who killed himself rather than give himself up.
And where is the prince?
The prince is outside the church of St. George's, St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier, I should point out, this is the one where Harry and Meghan got married not so very long ago,
Absolutely,
just for our worldwide audience. But ordinary Ethiopians have got much more important things to worry about, haven't they?
Yes, but this cause is supported by all Ethiopians. We are talking about a prisoner of war. And here he was, who stayed in the royal household and died, and you don't return him?
Well, can I put this to Tiffany? I'm only interrupting simply because
please,
the program's of a certain length.
Of course.
My suggestion here is that there are more important things for people to worry about. And in your research, do you find that there are prominent people who say this must happen, we have to have this back, but actually they have their own agendas, and other people would rather wish they sort of shut up about it?
I'm sure people do wish that. I mean, I think there has been a problem, which is that politics and culture have become too entangled. They're always related, and so culture is always used for political ends. But I think as kind of a future-orientated political solution has fallen off the agenda in the last 30 years, people have turned to culture to do certain things, such as make reparations for colonization. I sympathise with that, but I don't think it's possible. I think it burdens culture. And we have to appreciate what artefacts can do, which is tell us about the lives of past human peoples. Obviously, we're going to feel very strongly about that, but let's not burden them with more than they can actually achieve. I think you also have to ask who speaks for what community. And there is a danger sometimes that this becomes a bit racialized. So I would maybe the logic of that I could speak for where all artifacts made by middle-class women living in Edinburgh should be. And I think, there is something about the universality of culture that no matter who we are, where we're from, our gender, our class, we can kind of look at an artifact from another time and another place and kind of step outside ourselves for a moment. And I think that's quite an important thing that museums can kind of help with. So enlightenment, really.
Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the previous straplines of the British Museum, which they sort of developed when they were under attack, was illuminating world cultures. So that means you have to come to London to be illuminated. It all seems to be a very dodgy area. And just going back to Tiffany's other point, the current Turkish government actually began a political campaign for the return of artifacts from European museums about 15 years ago. And they did it as a form of foreign policy, where they said, we won't give you a license to dig if you're German unless you return artifacts. Some artifacts were returned.
Seems quite reasonable.
Yeah, some artifacts were returned, and statements were made in the national newspapers about how wonderful it was to do it. And I thought, hang on, is this what most Turks really care about?
Well, this is in a world that is dealing with austerity and on the verge, some suggest, of another recession. It's not at the top of an awful lot of people's shopping lists when you're voted into power, is it?
But it's about politics. Yeah. It's about national identity as it changes. And it's also about economic benefit.
Let me ask you one question before I go back to Tiffany for the closing bit. Afromet, gosh, it must be 10 years ago, when Tony Blair was in Addis Ababa, gave him a petition asking for the return of the Magdala treasures. Yes. Nothing's happened.
Nothing has happened since and
then.
there has been a continuing demand for the return of these looted items. We still, by the way, Afromet is a network of Ethiopians who believe that these things will be best served at their origin.
So the question really is, where's your campaign right now?
Our campaign right now, we are hopeful that the V&A exhibition, the Victoria and Albert exhibition, would prove something, that there is this need to return them. Loan is out of the question unless that loan is completely...
But you've heard nothing in 10 years, really, have you? So how hopeful are you?
We are hopeful. We never lose hope as Ethiopians. We never lose hope. But let me come at one point and stress it very profoundly. The idea that because Ethiopia is poor and has to engage in a pro-poor economic program, which she is, should completely ignore this call for the restitution. Look here, what are you denying us? You are denying us the right to get income through tourism of these treasures. Just because they are in here, people, instead of coming to Ethiopia, are coming to London. And you are telling that because UK is richer than Ethiopia, we can provide state-of-the-art museums, which Ethiopia can't. By the way, our museums have been our churches for centuries, and nobody dared them.
Mulugeta, thank you. Thank you. We wish you luck in that campaign. Tiffany, I want to come to you because you wrote about the Elgin marbles, the Parthenon marbles, which is basically a frieze, isn't it, taken from the top of the Parthenon by Lord Elgin. You don't think they should be moved. Whenever we have this discussion, it's always sort of one of the headline items. Do you think they will one day go back to Greece? Where is the story right now?
It changes dramatically depending on the narrative in which they're situated, right? So when Neil McGregor came to the British Museum about 15, 20 years ago, he did what the old director. As Tim said, he rebranded the institution as this place of world cultures where we can understand the interrelatedness of human cultures, which is a very positive thing. I think when he did that, they were very secure, whereas previously they weren't. Now I would say things are changing a little. I think you constantly have to reassess why you have artifacts in your collection and what you can do with them. That's not always a bad thing, because it is about kind of remaking the case for the institution and remaking the case of why we care so much, and we do.
Quick word from Tim. We talk about tourism for Ethiopia. If the Elgin marbles went back to the Parthenon, there might be an awful lot more visitors to Greece. Greece could do with the money. We're seeing mentions of new discoveries in Egypt the whole time. This is going round and round and round and round.
Absolutely. It's about tourism. Just going back to the Elgin marbles, one of the points about restitution or repatriation I feel strongly about is if the monument from which the stuff was originally looted is still there and still visible and still in its original state, it seems a very strong case for returning.
And they are very much still there,
yes,
those buildings. And the Greek people, the Greek country itself could do with a great deal of tourists going.
Sure.
Keeping the economy going. Listen, I want to thank you all very much indeed. It has been fascinating listening to your stories.
Thank you.
Hearing about what might be happening with the Magdala. Victoria and Albert Museum until I think June of
Absolutely,
of
of
next.
2019.
June of 2019. Thank you all very much for taking part in the programme. Thank you for watching. It has been my pleasure to listen to my guests today. I hope you feel the same. We'll be back with another roundtable very soon. From me, David Foster, goodbye for now. Great pleasure. Thank you.